take place on October the 1st, 1835. Now, before it happens, you have to understand why there was a battle in the first place. So let's go back to 1831. Green DeWitt was an impresario, and he sent a request to the Mexican government for some help because his colony kept on being attacked by Native Americans. So the Mexican government sent a small bronze cannon, and DeWitt stationed the cannon at Gonzales. In late September of 1835, jumping 4 years later, the Mexican government is going to ask for the Texans to give the cannon back. The people are going to refuse to give the cannon back. And they also take the soldiers that brought the message as hostage. So that means they keep them as prisoners. And they take the cannon and bury it in a peach orchard. They're not giving the cannon back. They go bury it. So the general who is in charge of retrieving the cannon, Ugarte, threatened the colonists and demanded that they give the cannon back. The colonists will not like this at all. So they decide that they are going to stall Ugarte and his men on their way to Gonzales. So before the Mexican army can get there, Gonzales is going to prepare for a battle to stand up against the Mexican government. Gonzales, the people of Gonzales, dug up the cannon and they sent it to the blacksmith and had him mount it to one of their people's cotton wagons. They built a militia of 180 men to fight against the Mexican army. And DeWitt's wife and daughter also will make a flag. It will be a white flag with black lettering that will read, "Come and take it." And the flag will also have one star and a cannon sewn into the field of white. It is going to be the first symbol of the Texas fight for independence and was meant to taunt the Mexican army. On October the 1st, 1835, we know that the battle takes place on this day. The Texans approached the Mexican camp. The Mexican soldiers were confused and fired the first shot. The Texans returned the fire, and the battle was very short. The Mexicans were ordered to withdraw or retreat, and the Texans had won the first battle of the Texas Revolution, which was the Battle of Gonzales. The Battle of Goliad. Martin Perfecto de Cos was a general in the Mexican army and was in charge of the forces that were occupying Texas at the time of the Battle of Gonzales. He ordered troops stationed at the garrison at Goliad to San Antonio for reassignment. That means he was moving people away from the garrison at Goliad to go ahead and see if he needs to put them somewhere else. And the Texans from all the communities along the coast heard about the Texas victory. So they know what's happening with troops being reassigned. They know that there are Texans victorious at Gonzales. So they decide they are going to organize a militia to capture the La Bahia Presidio at Goliad. It was a garrison. And garrisons where you can store military equipment. And it's also going to be almost like a fort. On October the 10th in 1835, the Texans stormed the Presidio and town and won the Battle of Goliad. There weren't very many Mexican soldiers there waiting for them, so it was really easy to take the garrison. Why was the move to capture the garrison at Goliad a strategic maneuver? This battle is important because it was a clear sign of rebellion because they did strategize before they went and took the garrison. They thought this out. They planned it out. The March on San Antonio. So the march to San Antonio is going to take place over a longer period of time than just a few days. The Texans wanted to begin organizing their military so that they could start thinking about actually winning independence against Mexico. The militias had become larger and many volunteers joined the Texian army. The regular army is what we might call that, or the real army. They will be a paid military. The men elected Stephen F. Austin as their general. They decided that their first goal would be to drive the Mexican general Cos and the Mexican army out of San Antonio. San Antonio is going to be one of those cities that if you have control of that city, then you pretty much are going to have control over most of Texas. So they planned to march on San Antonio and conduct a siege. Remember, a siege is when you surround your enemy, try to starve them out so that they will surrender. The Texans had many setbacks on the way, though. The men were unorganized. They did not follow orders well. And rains had made it difficult to be able to haul cannons long distances on muddy roads. So many of these cannons that they had brought with them are going to be left behind in the middle of a muddy road or in a ditch because they can't carry them along in those rough conditions. Once the Texans arrived in San Antonio, the Texan residents were glad to see the Texian army. So these San Antonio citizens are going to support the Texans in their efforts to conduct a siege. While General Cos and his army occupied San Antonio, the Mexicans had begun to oppress the people of San Antonio, even the well-respected Tejanos. The people of San Antonio were forced to give up their homes because officers forced them to use the practice of quartering, where they would take over somebody's home and live there. Women were forced to take time out of their days to make tortillas for the army to be able to feed the army. And Erasmo Seguin, the contributor to the writing of the Constitution of 1824, very knowledgeable whenever it comes to law and government. He's that go-between person that the colonists will go to if they want to make a new law to make sure that it's constitutional. And he's also the person that the Mexican government's going to go to if they see that there might be some type of new law that these colonists will have to follow. He's like their interpreter of sorts. So this well-respected Tejano leader was forced to sweep the streets of San Antonio just because he'd been involved in writing the Constitution of 1824. Because by this point, Santa Anna had abolished it. So anyone that had been involved with writing and upholding the rights that were in the Constitution of 1824 are almost going to be targeted at this point. So outraged, Seguin's son, Juan Seguin, joined the Texian army and began to organize a group of Tejanos to fight with the Texians. More setbacks are going to take place once they actually get camped in San Antonio. More than 100 more men are going to join the Texian army, which is going to make the army grow bigger than what they were expecting for that time. So it made it difficult to organize that large group. The men were untrained and ill-equipped. The Mexican army had a very large cavalry. So most, where it says most were cavalry, that should say infantry. Most were infantry. That means they were on foot. But the Mexican army had a cavalry. That means they were on horseback. So strategies for the setbacks. Well, if you're having trouble organizing men, they wanted to find a better location to be able to organize a bigger group so that they could hold a successful siege. They also wanted to find a place that could be used to train this large group of men. They also wanted to build a cavalry. If the problem is most of your men are infantry, then the solution would be, okay, well then build a cavalry. So Stephen F. Austin is going to send Jim Bowie, he was a Louisiana frontiersman, to go scout for a new headquarters or a new camp. Stephen F. Austin will also put Juan Seguin in charge of building a Tejano cavalry. Remember, San Antonio, the surrounding area, was full of Tejano ranches, so it makes sense that there would be people that would be skilled on horseback in the area. The Battle of Mission Concepcion. So when Jim Bowie was sent out to scout for a new headquarters, General Cos heard word, and he sent a unit of 400 soldiers to ambush this scouting party led by Jim Bowie. So Jim Bowie and his men were at the Mission Concepcion south of the city when they were ambushed. Bowie and his men are going to strategically withdraw and retreat to a spot so that they can prepare themselves for battle. So he and his men positioned themselves on a hill that hung over a riverbed. And this is going to be a good geographic spot to fight from. If you're going to be in a battle, you want to look for something called the high ground advantage. So although Bowie and his men were totally outnumbered, this defensive position that he put him and his men in is going to be perfect to fight against a larger number. Plus, he has a large group of sharpshooters on his side. So this is going to lead to their victory, which in the end is going to be excellent because Texas is going to feel more confident in what they are doing. And whenever news comes back that Bowie and his small group of men have beaten a unit of 400 soldiers, Stephen F. Austin is going to be fired up. He's going to want to go straight into the heart of San Antonio and immediately fight. But he's going to get talked down by a few wise men who are going to let him know, well, the walls of the city are still too strong. We haven't been able to breach the city in a way that would be an advantage. And the siege is really not holding at this point. The siege is not doing its job of starving these people out and also making it so that they're running out of supplies. So they decide to relocate the headquarters. Jim Bowie's purpose was to go and find a new spot. So he suggests that they move the camp to a place called Old Mill. So Stephen F. Austin says, okay, well, let's move to Old Mill, and we are going to plan out a better siege, a successful siege. Scouts had reported that the city was well supplied, so they were going to be there for a while, and the cold weather begins to set in. In the middle of the siege, Stephen F. Austin was offered a job as a commissioner in the United States. This was a diplomatic position, so this was a position where he'd be able to negotiate for Texas. Stephen F. Austin thought that this job would use his skills and his talents to help the Texans in a better way than leading the army. That's not really his expertise, but being able to negotiate is. So he is going to put his talents to work for these Texans and leave. The new leadership will be Edward Burleson. The soldiers will vote for him to be their new general. That leads us to the grass fight. So a scout named Erastus Deaf Smith, we're just going to call him Deaf. Some people call him Deef. He's going to report that more than 100 Mexican soldiers with pack animals were on their way into San Antonio on the old San Antonio Road. Now, the rumors were that they were bringing in a large shipment of silver to pay the Mexican soldiers, because remember, a regular army or a professional army is going to get paid. The Texans organized an ambush to steal the silver, because if you're involved in a war, then it's expensive. Another thought on that would be, what would happen if you had a job and your boss was not able to pay you? What would be the next step? So think about it from the Mexican soldiers' perspective. If they were far away from home and they were expecting to receive a paycheck but they didn't get it, then what would be their next step? So anyway, the Texans organized an ambush led by Colonel Jim Bowie. He's gaining respect as he goes. When Bowie and his men ambush the wagons, they are going to realize these bags are not full of silver. We should hear some jangling, and that was not what they were hearing. And the bags were not really as heavy as what they should be. They were heavy, but just not as heavy as they should be. So they looked in the bags, and the bags were full of grass, which was meant to be feed for the animals. Now, the Texans are going to be disappointed that they're not going to be able to have this silver, but whenever they get back and they start talking about things, they realize this is good news, because the grass was meant to feed animals. If they're trying to sneak in feed for the animals, then that means they are running out of supplies. And if they're running out of supplies, then that means that the siege was working. General Burleson wanted to attack immediately whenever he found out that the siege was successful at this point. He wanted to attack immediately, but he was encouraged to withdraw from San Antonio and regroup and reorganize. That means he was encouraged to just stop the siege. You have to be very patient for a siege to work. So those that were around him were saying, nah, let's just pack up and leave. The siege isn't working. Whenever there was evidence that was showing that it was working. So December the 4th, 1835, the day that Burleson had planned for everybody to start packing up and heading out of San Antonio, a scout brings in a Mexican scout. And that Mexican scout is going to spill his guts. That means he is going to divulge information. He is going to tell the Texians exactly what's going on inside of the city with the Mexican army. He's going to report that the Mexican army is weak. They are worn down from this siege. They're tired of waiting. They're getting hungry. When that information is shared, a guy named Colonel Ben Milam, however you want to pronounce it, rallied the men, and he's going to say, who's going to go with me? Because I'm going to go ahead and go storm the city. And 300 men will answer yes. So Ben Milam and Francis W. Johnson gathered the 300 that volunteered at Old Mill to prepare to storm the city. They attacked December the 5th, 1835, early in the morning, and the men are going to jump from house to house, from roof to roof, taking the city block by block. On the third day of the battle, Ben Milam is going to be wounded, and he is going to die. The person that said, let's go, he's not going to make it through. December the 9th, the Texans pushed all the way to the center of the city. December the 10th, 1835, the Mexican General Martin Perfecto de Cos was forced to surrender San Antonio to the Texian forces. So the Texans win. This is the Battle of San Antonio. So the result of this will be that many Texans are going to think that the fighting is over. They have San Antonio now. Now they can be independent as a state. They weren't trying to fight for independence as a country yet. They just wanted to be an independent state from Coahuila. So this meant that they thought that they had become the Lone Star State. Some people from the U.S. are actually going to think that all the fighting's over and start immigrating into Texas again. So they're going to start moving to Texas, that land of opportunity. But Santa Anna is going to have other plans for these people, because he's going to plan to march to Texas and put down this rebellion himself. So the Texans debated on how they should move forward from this point on. The main question was, how do we deal with Mexico? So the delegates from the colonies headed to San Felipe de Austin, the capital of Austin's colony, to have a meeting, and they called it the Consultation of 1835. So whenever the meeting began on November the 4th, 1835, they decided that they wanted to write a declaration so they could declare what was going on in Texas to the Mexican government. They called it the Declaration of November the 7th. And really what it said is that we were right to fight against the Mexican army. We were justified because we were just defending our rights that were listed in the Constitution of 1824. It's going to say that they were not in rebellion, although what they were doing looked like it was clearly a rebellion. They're going to say, oh, we were not rebelling. We were just fighting for our rights. And they explained that they were fighting because Santa Anna abolished the Mexican Constitution. So if he abolished the Mexican Constitution, they had every right to govern themselves and make their own rules for their lives. The consultation in this declaration, they're going to not only make the declaration, but they are going to prepare for the future. So they made a provisional temporary state government. A provisional government is a temporary government. In their government for their state, they elected Henry Smith to be their governor. Now, he was part of the war party, so you'll get some of his opinions on how he's going to govern Texas based off of that. Stephen F. Austin, William H. Wharton, and Branch T. Archer were sent to the U.S. as commissioners or diplomats. Their goal was to rally U.S. support. Sam Houston had showed up at this point, and he was elected as commander-in-chief of the regular army. Not the militia, just the regular army. A navy was created to prevent supplies from getting to Mexico. They were trying to practice a blockade, where you set your ships out to intercept any goods trying to reach your enemy's territory. Privateers were hired to be a part of the Navy. Francis W. Johnson and James Grant were sent to Matamoros to take the city. That is on the southernmost border. Sam Houston and William Goins were sent to East Texas to negotiate with the Cherokee. The Cherokee had come from Georgia and the Carolinas, but they had been removed from their homes and relocated to East Texas and then Oklahoma. So this is part of the Indian Removal Act. The Texian government had no clear goals at this point in time, and they argued about independence, whether or not they should become an independent country. So they voted to meet back on March the 1st. So they decided we need some time, we need to sleep on it before we make a decision on whether or not we want to declare independence from Mexico and become our own independent nation, or if we want to stay a state in Mexico, just be separated from Coahuila. And then Davy Crockett arrives on the scene. So David Crockett was a Tennessee congressman, and he had become a legend because of his involvement in battles against Native Americans in what we call the Indian Wars, and because of his great skill as a frontiersman. He just had this way about him that he knew where he was, even out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the frontier, out in the wilderness. He knew how to find his way. He arrived in Texas on January the 9th, 1836, in Nacogdoches. He was somewhat of a celebrity, so these Texans are going to throw him a party and welcome him by firing off the cannon, because it's the closest thing to fireworks that they have. So Crockett thought, like many others that are going to show up in Texas, that the fighting was over and it was the perfect time to settle in and have a brand new start. Now, he needed a new start because he'd lost an election. So rules of politics: get elected and then get reelected. And the second didn't happen for him. He did not get reelected, so he needed to start over. His last letter that he will write in his life is going to be to his children, and he is going to explain how beautiful it is in Texas and what a great opportunity that it will be for not just him, but even for them to relocate there and to start fresh. In January 1836, Santa Anna and Urrea, that's another general, advanced with a force of about 6,000 men. Sam Houston sent Bowie and Henry Smith to tear down the Alamo. But that doesn't sound right, because we know from history that the Alamo was still standing. So after inspecting the Alamo, Bowie and Smith are going to go to Sam Houston and beg him to fortify it instead of tearing it down. Save the Alamo. So they convince him, and fortifications, that process begins with a man named Green Jameson. He was an engineer who had a palisade and new walls built for the Alamo. He was shoring up the Alamo so that if they were attacked, then they would be able to hold down the fort, literally to hold down the fort. Almiron Dickinson was a cannoneer, and he was the one who would strategically set up the 21 cannons that were going to be stationed at the Alamo. By the way, one of those cannons is going to be the very cannon that was buried in a peach orchard in Gonzales and then dug back up and used against the Mexican army. Day 1. February 23rd, 1836, Santa Anna and the Mexican army were spotted on the El Camino Real outside of San Antonio. Settlers and defenders both ran into the Alamo, and they sealed the doors shut. Santa Anna tried to negotiate a surrender, but William B. Travis, who shared command, by the way, with Jim Bowie, answered negotiation with a cannon shot. Santa Anna raised the no quartering flag, and then on the second day, Santa Anna and the Mexican army started their continual bombardment. The second day, the defenders are going to fire back. So at this point, Jim Bowie collapses from an illness, so no longer will he be able to share command because he is incapacitated. So William B. Travis is going to have to be in command by himself, and he orders the Texians to hold their fire because it is a siege. There's no need to waste ammo because they're going to be there for a while. William B. Travis wrote his famous plea on this day, asking for help. Days 3 through 7. So this is February 25th through the 29th, and yes, 1836 was a leap year. Santa Anna and the Mexican army fired on the Alamo daily. The defenders held down the fort. Juan Seguin, Deaf Smith, and James Bonham, who was from Alabama, were sent for help. On the 8th day, March the 1st, 1836, away from the Alamo, so away from San Antonio, delegates met at Washington on the Brazos to vote whether or not to declare independence. While they were voting, the defenders at the Alamo were holding down the fort. Bonham snuck back into the Alamo, and he led the Mobile Grays. So there's going to be a small amount of men who are going to be able to come and help out a little bit for the final battle. Crockett will also lead 12 Tennessee volunteers, and 32 volunteers arrived from Gonzales, led by Captain Al Martin. So Gonzales is going to show back up and help out. On the 9th day of the siege, March the 2nd, 1836, the delegates at Washington on the Brazos declared independence. Sam Houston headed to Gonzales to try to organize the regular army. And no help will be sent to the Alamo, even though William B. Travis has pleaded with them to send help. So in total, the defenders will be about 189 men. We don't know the exact tally, but this is the count that we know. The Mexican army in San Antonio will total about 2,000. So this is an impossible task for these Texians that are in the Alamo. These defenders is what we call them. Day 12, March the 5th, 1836. This is where we get the legend of the line in the sand, where we hear about William B. Travis drawing a line in the sand in the middle of the courtyard in the Alamo compound. And he is going to be real with these men who are about to fight and die, and let them know you are going to fight and you are going to die if you stay here, and gives them an option to leave the Alamo. And the rumor is, because this is not confirmed, so this means if this is a legend, that means we don't have enough evidence to prove that it actually happened. So anyway, the legend says that every man joins him on his side of the line because he's told them, I'm going to stay and fight for Texas, and gives them the opportunity to stay and fight too. And the legend is all but one man are going to follow him and fight to their death. The one man that is going to leave, it's rumored to be a man named Luis Rose. Siege of the Alamo, the last day, on the 13th. This is where the Battle of the Alamo will take place, March the 6th, 1836. This is the day that the Alamo fell. Mexico will play their song El Deguelo, and this is going to happen before the attack begins. It's an intimidation tactic. Texas will push back the Mexican army. Mexico fell back and then regrouped for their second attack. Mexico then will attack again, breach the walls, and turn the cannons around on the Texians. The Alamo fell, and all the defenders were killed in the battle. The survivors of this attack are going to be non-combatants. Some of them will be Susanna Dickinson and her children, Anna Salazar Esparza and her children, and a slave named Joe. Later events and battles of the Texas Revolution. So the next thing we'll look at is something called the Runaway Scrape. On March 11th, after the Alamo has fallen, Sam Houston is going to reach Gonzales, and he hears news about the Alamo. Sam Houston sent Deaf Smith to the Alamo to go gather information. On March the 12th, Deaf Smith returned with the survivors, and Susanna Dickinson is going to tell her story of what happened. Deaf Smith delivered information to Sam Houston that Santa Anna and the Mexican army were on their way to Gonzales. They're going to start hunting down anyone that was at Washington on the Brazos who signed the paperwork to declare independence against Mexico. So to break free from Mexico. Anyone that was at that meeting that said, yes, let's break free, is going to be on a list where Mexico will hunt them down. So Sam Houston ordered the retreat, and he gave the command to burn Gonzales to the ground. And then the people of Gonzales and the surrounding towns ran away to the east. Now you have to think about this from the people's perspective. They had just left everything that they knew in the United States, and they had just started building a life for themselves. And it's hard work to build your own home with your own two hands, and then they're going to have to burn it all to the ground. It's going to be a tough thing, this runaway scrape. Then we get to the Goliad massacre. So meanwhile, while all this is happening, General Fannin at Goliad was told to retreat to the east as well. But Fannin hesitated. So he was caught by Uriah, and there was a battle called the Battle of Coleto Creek. Uriah captured Fannin and 300 men at Coleto Creek, and Uriah is going to hold Fannin and the 300 men that were with him as prisoners of war at Goliad. So that garrison is going to keep all these soldiers as prisoners there. So Uriah will keep them there. Uriah was sent word from Santa Anna to execute all the Texans. So he sent word to Santa Anna, hey, we've captured all these guys. What do we do with them now? And Santa Anna is going to say, kill them all. So Uriah will put these men in front of a firing squad, and he is going to try to execute every single one of them. So the thing about having a firing squad for this many people is that if you fire with the type of guns that they had, even at a close range, you might miss. There might be a misfire here and there. And these guns are going to put out a lot of gun smoke. So there's going to be these huge clouds of gun smoke. And there will be a young woman named Francita Alves that will seize an opportunity to save some people's lives. She'll see the people that are still standing and still alive, run into the gun smoke, and lead the survivors out to safety. And because she is going to save some of these men from the firing squad, she is going to be called the Angel of Goliad. Fannin and almost all of the 300 are going to be killed. Almost. Because of Francita Alves, not all will be killed. The Battle of San Jacinto. So all of Texas and even the U.S. hear of the heroics. Well, based off of whatever perspective, they're going to see these events as heroics at the Alamo and at Goliad. Santa Anna believes at this point that he has crushed the spirit of these Texians, but really his actions really just will stir them up. So we call that kicking the hornet's nest. New volunteers will join the Texian army in droves, and they will come up with a new battle cry. Remember the Alamo, and also remember Goliad. Sam Houston ordered a strategic withdrawal, moving steadily through the east until April the 12th, 1836, where he will have his men camp at a place close to Harrisburg. He'll move them from a place called Gross's Plantation towards Harrisburg, and he sets up this camp on the mouth of the San Jacinto River in the middle of an oak grove. Now, the oak grove is going to not only serve as a muffler for the sounds of the army, but it's also going to put them in a strategic position where they have a place to retreat to. So they have cover in the middle of a fight. Santa Anna followed the Texian army and set up camp in an adjacent field that was pretty much just an open prairie. So nowhere to really retreat to and hide behind if there was a fight to take place. There's nowhere to take cover. April the 20th, some fighting is going to take place, but the Mexican army was unable to gain an advantage of any sort. So they are going to spend the entire night of April 20th and into the early morning hours of April 21st trying to build defenses. So build different little things that they can hide behind in order to have cover out in the middle of an open field. So Sam Houston's going to realize that he has a tactical advantage here, and that is, well, one, his enemy is out in the middle of an open field with very little cover, even though they built defenses all night long. Plus, he's going to have an enemy that is tired. So on April the 21st, Sam Houston met with his officers at noon to vote and see if they should attack the Mexican army. And the vote was a unanimous yes. At this point, they'd been waiting to attack, and they were ready to avenge those that had died in the Alamo and those that had died at the Goliad massacre. So the Texians attacked the Mexican army at 3 p.m. Sam Houston led the charge, and the Texas army snuck into the Mexican camp, and they're going to be screaming, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." So they wake them up with this wake-up call, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," and the battle was over in 18 minutes. And just like that, independence is going to be won for these Texans. After the battle, Santa Anna was found hiding in the marshes that surrounded the area. Sam Houston spares his life, so spares the life of Santa Anna, because they needed Santa Anna to sign a treaty to legally end the war for independence and to legally give independence to Texas. So there were two treaties. They were called the Treaties of Velasco that ended the war and gave independence to Texas. One of them was a secret treaty. The other one was a public treaty. Once Santa Anna returned to Mexico, he will claim that the treaties were illegal. So there are some conditions that will really kind of put Texas in a tough position to be able to refute this. So to be able to argue that, yes, they are legal. So Mexico said that Santa Anna was forced to sign the treaties as a prisoner. So if he was signing them as a prisoner, then diplomatically it probably was forced. He also said, so Santa Anna also said that the Texans violated the treaties because in the secret treaty, Santa Anna was supposed to be sent back to Mexico City as soon as the treaties were signed. But instead, he was sent to Washington, D.C. to enter into peace negotiations so that the U.S. could be a mediator between the Texans and Mexico. He said that this broke the conditions of surrender, so the treaties, in Santa Anna and Mexico's opinion, did not count.